The Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Glad you're here. Happy Super Tuesday. There are so many possibilities and scenarios here that we can talk about. And in the end, as we'll talk about at the end of the show, anything can be spun into anything the media wants, right? So Sanders could win every state and somehow the media would spin it into a victory for Biden, right, if they wanted to. And as we'll talk about here coming up in a few minutes, we're going to go into great scientific detail about how the delegates are apportioned based on individual vote tallies per congressional district. And in the end, that doesn't even really matter because the Democratic Party can do whatever they want. So with those two giant disclaimers initially made to review, the disclaimer is it doesn't really matter. That being said, we're going to continue to press on as if it does. So here's the deal. 14 states. We've got Alabama, Arkansas, California, where I live right now, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, where Trump was yesterday at his rally that we aired here on the 1st, Oklahoma, Tennessee, my adopted state, Texas, Utah, Vermont, and Virginia. Those are the 14 states up for grabs today, and like American Samoa and Puerto Rico or something. So all the debating and caucusing and all the rigmarole so far has resulted in 149 delegates. That's it. Like Iowa's like 20 delegates, maybe. Today, so we've had 149 delegates awarded so far. Today, there's 1,357 delegates that Biden, Bernie, and Elizabeth Warren are going to be fighting over. Really, it's Biden, I should say Biden, Bloomberg, Bernie, Biden, Bloomberg, and Warren are going to be fighting over. Warren may win Massachusetts. That's not even guaranteed, which would be pretty embarrassing. But other than that, I don't think she'll win maybe 5 more delegates, and we'll talk about why coming up here in a little bit. So we're going to get into the weeds for a few minutes. Let's start the clock here. We'll do 3 minutes of getting into the weeds here. Math, so I've hosted a radio show for years. Math is really hard on the radio, so we'll see how well it goes on the TV here. So Bernie Sanders needs 1,991 delegates, there it is, going into the convention to secure the nomination. That's the majority of delegates, 1,991. So they do the first round of voting, and all the delegates who go into the convention are pledged. They're pledged delegates. You delegate must vote for the person that the people of your state told you to vote for. So you go into the first round of voting, and you're a Sanders delegate. You have to vote for Bernie Sanders. If he gets 1,991 delegates on that first round of voting, then it's over, presumably, unless the party again just decides to blow the whole thing up and do whatever they want in the end. But if we're going to play the game here, he gets 1,991 delegates, and it's it. He's the nominee for president for the Democratic Party. If the first round of voting, he does not, or no one gets 1,991, no one gets that majority, then it's totally game on. It's absolutely free for all. All the delegates can do whatever they want. So that Bernie Sanders delegate, or that person who went in who had to be a Bernie Sanders delegate, is now like, I like John Kerry, or whatever. They can do literally whatever they want. And there's 3,979 delegates. They can do whatever they want. And during the second round of voting, they throw in an additional 771 super delegates just to mix things up a bit. And obviously they can do whatever they want. This is where Bloomberg comes in. So stay tuned. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, it looks like, and a lot of this really depends on today, Sanders is in the lead. Right? He's the presumed nominee if all things go in this direction at this pace. He'll be in the lead, at least. If Biden does really well today, if Biden outperforms what people have been thinking, then it's likely we're going to be headed to a brokered convention. Now, if he crushes it, then I guess he could win, but it's unlikely that he'd get the 1,991, right? So the best Biden can really hope for is to prevent Bernie from getting 1,991. So if Biden does really well today, then we're probably headed to a brokered convention. If Bloomberg does surprisingly well in Texas and California, then we're probably going to have a brokered convention as well, because they will both be keeping Sanders from that 1,991 number. If Sanders crushes it today, then there's a higher chance that he'll get that first round of voting and win. Are you with me so far? Okay. So 1,991, that's the majority of delegates. Today, there's 1,357 delegates up for grabs. But it is not like the presidential election. It is not winner take all, right? So for the presidential election, for the electoral college for most states, like Trump won Wisconsin by, it was like 14,000 votes or something like 20,000 votes, something really, really small margin. But he gets all the electoral college votes, right? If he won Wisconsin by 1 vote, he would get all the electoral college votes. Right? With the Democratic primary, it's not winner take all, it's proportional. Which leads us to I would argue, the most important number to keep in mind today, and that is 15. 15%. There it is. That's the most important thing. If a candidate gets above, let me word it this way. If a candidate gets below 15%, they get nothing. It's like they weren't even there. So this is Tom Steyer. Tom Steyer spent all of his money in South Carolina. He spent like $67 million or something like that. Spent all of his money in South Carolina, and he got 11% of the vote, and therefore 0 delegates, because that's less than 15. You get 0 delegates, right? So a candidate needs 15% of the vote in order to be eligible to get even a single delegate. If they don't get 15%, it's like they're not even there. And actually, which we'll get to in a second, they take that person's votes and distribute them to the people who did get above 15%. But let's give an example. So let's take California, because that's the big state today, obviously. Twice as many delegates as Texas, almost. So if Sanders, Biden, and Bloomberg all get above 15%, but Elizabeth Warren gets 12%, it's as if she got 0 votes. And her votes are proportionately distributed to the other 3 candidates who did get above 15%. Right? So let's say Bernie gets 60% of the vote in California, Biden gets 20, and Bloomberg gets 18, whatever. Then they take Elizabeth Warren's votes, and Biden gets 60% of them, or Bernie gets 60% of them, Biden gets 20% of them, Bloomberg gets 18% of them, and it's added to their vote total and their vote proportion, right? And then they allocate the delegates accordingly, okay? So that's how they determine how many delegates each candidate actually gets. The fewer, and the reason I want to talk about this is because you're going to be watching election returns today on whatever channel or whatever. No one's going to talk about 15%, right? Everyone's going to be like, Bernie wins California. And you're like, okay, that's something to note, but that's not everything. There are scenarios where, let's say Bernie gets 30% of the vote in California, where if it's only him and Biden who get above 15%, Bernie gets a ton of delegates. But there's a scenario where if Bernie only gets 30% of the vote, but a lot of people get above 15, then he gets very few delegates. Even though he gets the same number of votes, the same percentage of votes, depending on how many people get above that 15% threshold, completely changes how many delegates Bernie Sanders actually gets. So step 1 is who wins, but step 2 that is completely essential is who also gets above 15%. So the fewer people who get above 15%, so it's going to be, in most states, it's going to be Sanders and Biden, right, who get above 15. That helps whoever wins, I should say, right? The fewer people who get above 15, it's going to help whoever wins that state. So if you're a Bernie Sanders fan and Bernie wins California, you want to look at, first you want to win, right? You're a Bernie's fan, you want to win, but you also want to make sure no one else gets above 15%, or if someone does, that one other person, right? Because that means those extra delegates, those extra votes are going to be redistributed among fewer people, which means you're going to get more delegates in the end. If you are, so how do I word this? If you are no, let me just end this. 15%, right? Final note there. Keep in mind 15% as you're watching the returns today. If you are a Trump supporter, if you're a Sanders supporter, you want Sanders not only to win, you want him to win by a lot, and you want as few people as possible to get above the 15%. Cool? If you're a Trump supporter, right? If you're a Republican and you're looking for chaos, today, you just want absolute chaos today, and you want chaos at the Democratic convention, then you want Bloomberg to do really well in California and Texas, which is where he spent a ton of money. He spent a ton of money in those two states because, first of all, they have the most delegates, but also no other candidate could spend a ton of money there. The media markets in California and Texas are really expensive, and there's a lot of them, right? So the Trump rally was in North Carolina yesterday. There's only one big media market in the North Carolina, Charlotte, right? So the candidates can spend money in Charlotte and do okay for the whole state. But no other candidate can afford to buy TV and radio in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego, right? Unless you have a net worth of $63 billion, which Bloomberg easily could, right? So if you're a Trump supporter, you want Bloomberg and Warren to get above 15%. And right now in California districts across California, Warren and Bloomberg are polling between 14 and 17%. So it's really close, but you want them to do really well. You want Bloomberg and Warren to do really well if you're a Trump supporter. And you want Sanders to do really well, but not too good, right? You don't want him to win outright, like totally, because then he may get above that majority. You want, right, if you're a Republican, you want chaos in the Democratic Party. You want it to be a two-man race going into the convention, and you don't want either of them to have a majority of the delegates. So then it becomes brokered and it becomes absolute madness. And I still stand by my prediction that if this becomes a brokered convention, then I believe Bloomberg gets it. I don't think Biden gets it. I think Bloomberg gets it because he has the money to pay off all the superdelegates to vote for him. That's my prediction. We'll see how today goes before I double down on that prediction. No more predictions now because we'll know like tomorrow. This is why I'm not a big fan of sports talk radio with a lot of predictions about the big game this weekend, because my theory is we'll just like wait a day and then we'll find out. I'm not going to talk for 3 days about who's going to win when I'll just find out soon. So I'll just say I'm not making any predictions, but the number one thing I'm going to be looking at is how well or poorly Bloomberg does, particularly in California, but also Texas. We're going to see if he can buy votes. This is a huge social experiment happening today with Bloomberg. We've talked about how Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York, bought support and bought silence from his opponents all throughout his political career. But can you buy votes? Can a New York City mayor buy votes in California with $500 million? I don't know. We'll see. Tom Steyer? No, he was not able to buy votes. $67 million, very few votes. Bloomberg spent something like $500 million, and he could totally bomb out and get like 5% of the vote, which would be so super embarrassing. Or he could get above that 15, stay in the race, and then go to the convention and spend $1 billion to buy off the delegates once they become free agents after the first round of voting. What a gloriously confusing and corruptible process that the Democrats have devised. I gotta take a break. One last point. Trump is gonna continue to support Bernie because he smells the chaos. Yesterday, in the midst of his endorsements for Republican candidates and going to North Carolina, he tweeted out that he said they're staging a coup against Bernie. Staging a coup. Who is? The establishment. And Trump wants nothing more than chaos in the Democratic Party. And Trump's gonna go big in for Bernie, making it a battle between the populist versus the establishment candidate. It's the people versus the smoke-filled back rooms of the DNC. And the establishment, they're going to try and steal it from Bernie again, whether they go with Biden or Bloomberg at the end. But for Trump, that doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter if Bernie wins or Bloomberg or Biden doesn't. From Trump's perspective, in the end, both sides will be bloodied beyond recognition and have no chance against a unified Republican Party. So he just wants absolute chaos. So Trump's going to continue to support Bernie, or if not support Bernie, that's a little much, but highlight all the ways that the swamp is in the tank for Biden. And that means supporting Bernie. Coming up next, I got one last thing I want to say about Bloomberg. I'm going to assume he tanks tonight, and that's it for him. And this is my last chance to do a relevant Bloomberg segment, right? So we're going to do that next. And how he is a massive egomaniac. He bragged at the debate the other day that he spent $100 million to get 21 congressmen in office. He spent $100 million for 21 measly congressmen. And if he's going to spend $100 million on that, you don't think he'd spend $1 billion to become the most powerful man on the planet? Of course he would, especially when you're an egomaniac like he is. And I got a really funny story about that next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I got such an interesting Mike Bloomberg story that I want to share here. First, this is a quick little bit that Trump did at CPAC about about Mini Mike. And just tell me that Trump's not funnier than any stand-up or any comedian on late night. Here it is.
She was really mean to Mini Mike. I'll tell you, the way she treated her. He didn't know what hit him. He's going, oh, get me off of this stage. Get me off. Get me off of this stage.
That's the best part. My wife and I, we watched that last night like 10 times. The best part, he's like, it's true. It's true. It's true. It's so good. All right, so we've talked a lot about Bloomberg lately. When he was mayor, how he would either buy support and endorsements or buy silence from his opponents. And it's amazing stuff that he's gotten away with. And he thinks he can do this on a national scale. And he could, because he has $63 billion. And we talked in the last segment, I'm not going to do it again, about how he could do this if there's a brokered convention. If you don't think it's possible for him to spend $1 billion to try and win a brokered convention by paying people off, I think it's because you don't know enough about Bloomberg's time as mayor. Ben Smith wrote an article in BuzzFeed in 2013. The headline was, Mike Bloomberg won't be there to buy everyone off in de Blasio's New York. And the point was that forever, corruption would come from the outside of government into politicians. But for the first time ever, the flow of corruption was reversed, with Bloomberg being the corrupt person paying off people outside of the government. And that was the whole point of the article, is that now Bloomberg's leaving and now the flow is going to be reversed again to like it's always been, where the corruption's outside paying off the politicians. But Bloomberg was the corrupt one always. Now, we've done that a million times. I want to go even deeper here. Why does Bloomberg have this God complex, if you will? Because hypocrisy is not, like the story I'm going to share here, you could file this under hypocrisy, but this is way worse than hypocrisy. This is next level. This is a New York Times article from 2009. This is in the midst of this whole kick where he was banning salt and trans fats and forcing restaurants to post calories and banning big gulps and sodas and whatever. You guys see the headline here? Here's an actual quote from the article. An examination of what enters the mayoral mouth. This is a real article from the New York Times. Reveals that Mr. Bloomberg is an omnivore with his own glaring indulgences, many of them at odds with his own policies, and he struggles mightily to restrain his appetite. As a billionaire in one of the dining capitals of the world, he can eat anything he wants. But he is obsessed with his weight so much that the sight of an unflattering photo of himself can trigger weeks of intense dieting and crankiness. So he has this campaign, he went on this campaign of everyone needs to drink more water, even though he drinks 4 cups of coffee a day. He led this big PSA in the city called Shake the Habit, encouraging people to use less salt. Check this out. But Mr. Bloomberg, 67 at the time, likes his popcorn so salty that it burns others' lips. At Gracie Mansion, the cook delivers it to him with a salt shaker. He sprinkles so much salt on his morning bagel, quote, that it's like a pretzel, said the manager at a Greek diner near Mr. Bloomberg's Upper East Side townhouse. They found a pizza, the New York Times, it sounds like a TMZ tabloid article here or something. It was the New York Times. They found a pizza place in Staten Island that he likes to go to. I can count on 2 hands, this is the guy who runs the pizza place. I can count on 2 hands the number of times I've seen him drink water. For New York City's richest man, his table manners are surprisingly relaxed. He's known to grab food off of the plates of aides and occasionally even strangers. Delicious, he declared recently after swiping a piece of fried calamari from an unsuspecting diner in Staten Island. Are you kidding me? Remember when people made fun of Trump because he ate Big Macs? This guy's going around stealing calamari off strangers' plates. Oh, delicious. There's some random guy. Could you believe that? So here's the reason I bring this up, other than it's hilarious. It's a fact of life that people who least have their life under control. Let me flip it around. The people who have their life under control the least are usually the loudest people telling you what to do with your life. How often have you gotten unsolicited parenting advice from people whose kids are little hellions, running around screaming, and then that parent gives you advice on something? How often have you got diet advice from someone who's overweight? Or driving advice from someone who's gotten in 10 different accidents? And this is different. It's like, you would say, have you ever gotten marriage advice from someone who's been divorced? But like, that's not right, because that person who's divorced may say, hey, listen, here's what I've learned. Here's the mistakes I made. Don't make the same mistake. Like, that's fine. There's truth there. But this is getting marriage advice from the guy who's on his 5th wife, thinking it's always her fault, right? And that's Bloomberg here. He's the one who needs to cut back on his salt. Not me. He's the one who needs to stop, I don't know, stealing food off strangers' plates. That's not a problem I have. But he's got a complex and he's projecting it onto you. If he can't control himself, then he's going to try and control you. George Orwell, he wrote in the early 1900s, he wrote a book about why normal people, those are his words, why normal people don't embrace socialism. And he said one reason is the type of people that socialism attracts as its biggest advocates are not mainstream people. Here's what he said. He said, one sometimes gets the impression that the mere words socialism and communism draw towards them with magnetic force every fruit juice drinker, nudist, sandal wearer, sex maniac, Quaker, nature cure, quack, pacifist, and feminist in England. So today they would throw in there like gender studies major and drag queen story hour advocate. Like these are the people that socialism attracts. And once you get that group, it's kind of a hard pitch to get the everyman on board. But it's those people who are telling the rest of us how to live our lives. Side story here, I got a minute. Side story just because it's too funny. AOC, did you see this a couple days ago? AOC was in a Twitter back and forth with Ted Cruz about coronavirus, and she wrote back, she said, Senator Cruz, blah, 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 I hold awards from the MIT Lincoln Lab and others for accomplishments in microbiology. Did you see that tweet the other day? And I thought, microbiology? Like, what are you talking? I thought you were like an econ major or something. It turns out, I'm not kidding, she got second place at a high school science fair. That's what she was talking about there. Now, in her defense, I do think it was a little more than like she built a baking soda volcano, like I did and everyone did. But it's like, she's making it seem like she, like a half a step below NASA. I don't even know why that came in my mind. That's apropos of nothing. We'll just go with it. Back to Bloomberg. I know nothing about his childhood, but I guarantee you that there's some background in Bloomberg's childhood of getting picked on, some trauma in his life for being short or overweight, there's some relationship breakdown with his mom or dad that caused trauma in him, that caused him to be super controlling. And he's not going to stop until he's controlling every aspect of your life either. He wants to control every aspect of his life, but he can't. So he's going to go after yours. Be careful of people, not just politicians, but anyone who wants control over your life. You'd think in America, you'd think we'd be more on guard against people like that. But we're not. Way too many. And we'll see it today on Super Tuesday. California, Texas, all these people vote for Bernie Sanders. And Bloomberg. Way too many people welcome these people with this massive God complex who want to control them. We welcome them in our lives with open arms. What a weird thing we do. Coming up next, I want to talk to a science journalist about the Spanish flu of 1918. What can we learn today about the coronavirus from what happened 102 years ago, which ended up killing 50 million people? So we'll talk about that next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Study Crusaders, really excited for our next guest because as a history major and a history buff, my instinct whenever something's going on is always to go back and look in history and see where there's any precedent for what we're dealing with. So with all this coronavirus talk, well, let's go back to what was the biggest pandemic maybe ever, but certainly in the last 100 or so years. And that's why I want to talk to Laura Spinney. She's the author of Pale Rider, The Spanish Flu of 1918 and How It Changed the World, and also a science journalist. Ms. Spinney, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. And you?
My pleasure. Doing very well. Thanks for being here. First, how massive, can you help us understand and put into perspective how massive this Spanish flu was in 1918?
So on current estimates, it killed at least 50 million people, 50. So that was about 2.5% of the global population at that time. It's thought that around 500 million people were infected by the virus, which was about a third of the global population. And just to put those numbers in a little bit of perspective, the First World War with which that pandemic overlapped is thought to have killed around 17 million people. Wow. And the Second World War, around 60 million people. So it was probably bigger than either of those disasters and may have been bigger than both of them put together.
Amazing. Quick science question. How was the Spanish flu different scientifically, like biologically, than maybe the normal flu or other things, other pandemics of the past?
It was a flu, it belongs to the flu family, but it was a particularly lethal flu. In fact, all seasonal flus start as a pandemic flu. They're like a novel strain in the human population, and they gradually moderate their virulence so that they kind of live more harmoniously with us, because it's in the virus's interest to keep its host alive, so we spread it around. But it was a very lethal flu, and it killed people in a particularly horrible way. They turned blue in the face, essentially drowned in their own fluids from their lungs overflowing with fluid. So they suffocated. So it was particularly horrible, to the extent that people didn't think it was flu. They confused it with much more serious diseases like typhus, cholera, or even pneumonic plague.
What was the medicine available back then compared to today?
Pretty lamentable, unfortunately. So the first problem was that, as you know, flu is caused by a virus, but virus was a relatively new concept in 1918. So most of the doctors in the world thought they were dealing with a bacterium. And that meant that they had no reliable diagnostic test. They had no effective flu vaccine. They had no antiviral drugs for treating the symptoms of those who were already sick, already infected, because they wouldn't be invented until the 1960s. And they had no antibiotics, which came in after the Second World War. And even though I said it was a viral disease, the vast majority of those 50 million deaths were caused by bacterial complications, which resulted in pneumonia. So antibiotics may have helped.
Wow. So nothing. We had nothing. What did they even pretend to do to treat this?
They had aspirin, the wonder drug, the so-called wonder drug. And it probably might have helped in some cases because it kind of reduces inflammation, and the kind of main clinical sign of that disease was massive inflammation of the lungs. But there was no real sense of accurate dosing at that time. And many doctors were so desperate to help, being largely helpless, that they gave too much aspirin. And they started exacerbating the symptoms. Lots of people suffered from the effects of aspirin poisoning just as much, if not more, than the flu. So it was a pretty bad situation. In fact, the thing that made more difference
No, please go on.
The thing that made more difference than the doctors was often the nurses, because if you could keep someone warm, hydrated, in bed and cozy, while they were going through the kind of crisis of it, then you could possibly make the difference between life and death, whereas a doctor couldn't.
Wow. Let me, a little off subject, but I'm really curious your take. So I am of this school of thought that I look back on the doctors and medicine of 1918, and as you said, lamentable. Like, they were so backwards, they didn't know anything. They were hurting, causing more harm than good. But in 100 years, do you think people will be looking back on 2020 and say, man, what a bunch of idiots they were back then. They didn't know anything.
No, I think that we've made quite incredible advances since then. On the other hand, we are still vulnerable in many ways. what is going to be the best protection against this coronavirus will be a vaccine, and everybody's hard at work on it, and they have made incredible progress in just the last few weeks. They've already sequenced the genome of the virus, which obviously wouldn't have been possible 100 years ago, and that's the first step towards making a vaccine. But the vaccine, even the first candidate, won't be in clinical trials until April, and the best estimates suggest it won't be clinically available, that is for us all to take, for a year. So what do we do in the meantime? We have are age-old measures, what so-called social distancing measures, such as quarantine, the hand washing, things that prevent the infection from passing from the sick person to the healthy person.
Yeah, and if it's not this coronavirus, it'll be something, and if that, probably more serious eventually, one time. What would you say the response was of the governments back in 1918? Were they slow to the draw, too heavy-handed? What happened?
Well, you have to take into account that it was a completely different world in many ways, one of the most important of which was that the world was at war. And what that meant for many countries, the warring nations, including yours and mine, Britain, France, where I live, and the US, was that they had heavy censorship. So they kept news of the disease for a very long time out of the newspapers because they didn't want to lower the morale of the population. And as we know now, clear and evidence-based and calm dissemination of information is absolutely crucial to managing an epidemic, because the best way to manage an epidemic is to have the population on your side, complying with your measures. We know that mandatory measures tend to be counterproductive, so you need them on side, and that means they need to be informed. But there was very little information at that time. Even, as I said, the doctors didn't even really know what they were dealing with. So they had a big handicap in that way. Some of the most advanced nations on earth in terms of public health, which included the US at the time, were pretty good at putting in place things like quarantine, and in New York City, for example, they staggered the rush hour, tried to avoid large gatherings of people, and they did that pretty well, and so cut, in fact, the eventual mortality rate with respect to other cities and countries. And that could make a difference, but the overall picture was pretty chaotic and pretty variable across the world.
I want to ask you about big, long-term effects that maybe we're still seeing today, but you mentioned rush hour traffic, staggering that. What were some day-to-day disruptions in people's lives during the height of the Spanish flu?
So that would probably be the main one. Mass gatherings were banned in many parts of the world, and that included religious gatherings, which made a big difference at that time, especially since a lot of people, their natural tendency was to see it as a kind of divine punishment at that time, even in the most advanced countries. Disruption of supply chains. Maybe the supply chains weren't as global as they were today, but when you've got, large numbers of your workforce, large proportions of your workforce in factories and shops out of action, then, supply chains are inevitably disrupted. The news itself was disrupted because the people working on newspapers were falling sick, and the people distributing newspapers were falling sick. So even on top of the censorship problem, the news was, there were large blank areas on newspapers because there was simply no one to fill them with print. The war itself was affected. So you had troops on both sides, falling sick and dying in large numbers. It didn't help that they were packed like sardines into trenches, and in many cases already compromised by malnutrition. Some of them had their lungs gassed. All of these would have lowered their defenses to a virulent respiratory bug. So there were many ways. I've only mentioned a few in which this disrupted ordinary life, but also life, so to speak, on the global stage.
I want to ask you real quick about supply chains, because this is something we're going to talk about a little later in the week, how today's supply chains are affected. There was a New York Times article the other day about almost all the surgical masks are made in China. But there's one company, is it Angers, France? Are you near Angers by any chance? Excuse my lack of French geography. But the other company that makes these surgical masks is in Angers, France, and they're on hyperdrive overload 24/7 to try and churn out as many masks as possible. So there's a lot of supply chain issues today. What was the supply chain problem back in 1918?
Well, as I said, it was more local because, things were more locally produced. But same problems. And also, global transport networks were disrupted. So there was no commercial aviation at that time. But there were the fastest mode of transport between nations was either train or steamship, depending on whether you're going by sea or by land. And the virus essentially traveled at that speed. It stopped people moving around, it stopped people producing, and this was all over the world. So it stopped long-term trade links as well as the more local things, which, people were more dependent on local supply at that time.
And I think that leads us to the big question I have for you is what effect of the Spanish flu 100 years ago, 102 years ago, do we still see today? What big giant global changes did it make?
Well, so for example, there are so many examples I could give. It affected the outcome of the First World War, arguably, because it interfered, as I said, it hastened the end of the war, but it also affected the peace process after the war, because many of the people in Paris who were negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, including Woodrow Wilson, came down with the flu. And there's a view, for example, that in Woodrow Wilson, it provoked a stroke. He had a massive stroke later that year, which a neurologist suggests was provoked by his case of flu in that spring. And that left him paralyzed down one side and effectively prevented him from persuading Congress to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and eventually joining the League of Nations. So it had a long-term effect in that way. In India, it got very tangled up with the whole movement towards independence. There was massive disapproval on the part of the indigenous Indians of the British colonial powers, who basically performed dismally in terms of looking after the health of the Indian population during that pandemic. And the people who came forward to help the sick were very often the militants in the independence movement. So Gandhi, who was emerging just then as the leader of the national independence movement, he basically garnered an enormous amount of support as a result of the pandemic. Or in South Africa, for example, there were moves. People were talking then about things like segregating cities along color lines. So the kind of roots of apartheid were already being discussed. But the pandemic, in which in that country whites blamed blacks and vice versa, but the whites blaming the blacks was the most politically visible dimension, if you like. In the early 1920s, right after the receding of the pandemic, you see the first apartheid-like laws coming in, for example, enforcing the segregation of cities along color lines. So, I mean, it also had, massive demographic implications. So, pregnant women in 1918 who caught the flu were very, very, very vulnerable to miscarriage and even death, which meant that a whole generation, the babies who were in the womb when the Spanish flu struck, as a generation, it was much diminished just in terms of numbers of people, but also the babies that survived the Spanish flu in the womb were slightly diminished both psychologically, cognitively, and physically. And unfortunately, that was a generation that got really hammered because those, when they became of age, it was time to go and sign up for the Second World War. Wow. So for me, that is the real lost generation of the 20th century.
Wow. Can you give, how did it affect, I was going to ask for what's a good ramification of the Spanish flu, something positive that maybe came out of it. But before I get to that, were there any other family makeup? Something we've been exploring on the show recently is the idea of the nuclear family. So is there anything about family that the Spanish flu affected?
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, one of the unusual things about the Spanish flu, because flu, as you know, normally affects particularly the very young and the very old. But that Spanish flu had a middle peak of mortality. So it really affected badly adults in the prime of life, that is between the ages of 20 to 40. And that had a massive impact on family structure because those were the breadwinners. Those were the pillars of communities at a time when, social welfare nets, safety nets, if you like, were threadbare in all of the, even in the richest countries. And there was absolutely no organized system of adoption either. So you see elderly people left dependent. Many are pushed into workhouses and things. You see we don't even know how many, and nobody's counting, but must have been millions of orphans created. We get little glimpses of what happened to them. They end up in juvenile, prisons or houses for juvenile delinquents, often because they're trying to survive in the streets with no family, and they were often pushed into committing crimes. So you get these little anecdotal glimpses, but we don't have any data on them, really. Nobody was counting or following them or seeing what happened to them in later life. Another really interesting implication, I think, is that because it was a time before antibiotics when the biggest killer of human beings was infectious diseases, rather than, now in the 21st century, sort of the more chronic degenerative diseases like cancer or Alzheimer's or heart disease. At that time, infectious diseases was still the biggest killer. And so what the Spanish flu did, interestingly, was it came in and it sort of purged in a very clinical, scientific sense. It purged the human population of people who were already ill with chronic infectious diseases, things like TB. And curiously, the effect of that was to leave a smaller, healthier population. And because people were healthier, they reproduced at higher rates. So in the 1920s, you see a baby boom. And in a way, that to me shows the extraordinary adaptability of the human species, because all these people had died and suddenly it replenishes itself with a new baby boom. Obviously, I'm talking at the population level. At the individual level, there was untold misery and suffering. But at the population level, humanity has this extraordinary ability to bounce back.
Yeah, very good. I got, Laura, I could talk forever. I got like 30 seconds. Knowing, and obviously you're a scientific journalist and historian on this, what do we need to know, or what posture should we take moving forward with this potential coronavirus threat or whatever pandemic is to come in our lifetimes?
I think the thing is, what we're seeing at the moment, and we definitely haven't seen the full profile of this new virus, if you like. We don't understand it, so I would not be foolish enough to make any predictions. But I think what we're seeing is that we are still not very good at containing these viruses when they spill over into humanity. Okay, so the Chinese make gargantuan efforts to contain this one. And the rest of us are doing our best since it has left China, including the WHO, which obviously did not exist in 1918. And despite that, it's spreading. So I think that I don't think I'm misrepresenting the public health community if I say that our resources should be going more into prevention, into preventing these things spilling over in the first place. So, for example, in China, that would be improving food safety. And so in beefing the robustness of health infrastructure, hospitals and so on, all over the world, but especially in the poorest parts of the world, because we're only as safe as our least safe place.
Yeah, really good. Superb. Laura Spinney, Pale Rider, The Spanish Flu of 1918, How It Changed the World. Go buy it. It's like been out for 2 or 3 years now, but never more relevant than now. Miss Spinney, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate you.
It's my pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
Hope we can talk again. More coming up. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. I think this is a good final thought on this Super Tuesday. And obviously, we're going to have a ton of follow-up, post-analysis. Me, Jesse, Dana, Buck, everybody. But I'll leave you with some parting thoughts. So I wrote a book like 2-3 years ago called How to Change Someone's Mind. I have some stories in there, available now, $5 on Amazon. Got some stories in there showing us how it's done, but the trick is, it's not what you say. What you say barely matters at all. It's how you say it. And more important than that even, it's the questions you ask. It's really a book about how we talk to each other. Because the truth is, you can't change somebody's mind if they don't want it to be changed. So the real goal of the book is not to change somebody's mind, it's to get somebody to want to change their mind in the first place. Yelling at somebody to change their mind will never work, and I'll prove to you that it'll never work, because have you ever changed your mind when somebody has yelled at you? Of course not. So what makes you think it would work on somebody else? It doesn't. Facts don't change our mind either. All right, we share examples of this all the time. Just a relevant example from yesterday or 2 days ago was the whole Trump called coronavirus a hoax story. I heard Trump say it live. I heard Trump say that the Democrats' criticism of him is a hoax. It's the latest hoax. Mueller, Russia, it's the latest hoax. And I thought, oh man, I guarantee you that the media is going to come out and say that Trump says coronavirus is a hoax. And sure enough, like 2 hours later, stories everywhere about, oh, President Trump called coronavirus a hoax. I was like, oh, I watched it live. That's not what he said at all. And then a few hours after that, my mom calls. My mom hates Trump. And she said, can you believe that the president called it a hoax? I said, oh, Mom, you fell for it. You fell for it. And it's because she wanted to. And nothing will change her mind. Nothing will change anyone's mind who wants to think that Trump said that. Same thing as Charlottesville, to find people on both sides stories. It's the exact same thing. You can show people the transcript, you can show them the video, it doesn't matter. They've already made up their mind. Facts don't change our minds. James Clear wrote an article on this, and he quoted Leo Tolstoy, which is a quote I wish I had when I wrote my book. Tolstoy said, the most difficult subjects can be explained to the most slow-witted man if he has not formed any idea of them already. But the simplest thing cannot be made clear to the most intelligent man if he is firmly persuaded that he knows already, without a shadow of a doubt, what is laid before him. That's just another very nice way of saying that he already knows the truth. He thinks he knows, doesn't want to change his mind. We are not motivated by the truth. We're actually motivated by belonging to a tribe. And we talk about that in my book as well. There's this primal need to survive in a tribe. And then there's a secondary desire to belong, like an emotional desire to belong. If we change our minds, we literally fear that we're going to be kicked out of our tribe and left to be attacked by a saber-toothed tiger alone, right? And if we change our minds, we fear that no one will love us, no one will accept us anymore. We'll be kicked out of that tribe. That's why it's really hard to get someone to change their mind. Steven Pinker, he's a Harvard psychologist. He wrote this. He said, people are embraced or condemned. But let's focus on the embrace. People are embraced according to their beliefs. So one function of the mind may be to hold beliefs that bring the belief holder the greatest number of allies, protectors, or disciples, rather than beliefs that are most likely to be true. People don't have a pursuit of truth, they have a pursuit of belonging. So if you want to change somebody's mind, there's a few necessary conditions that need to be met first. We don't have time to go over those now, but the root of it is friendship. People need to believe that as they leave one tribe, they'll be welcomed into another. All the stories that I share in the book, whether it's a black man convincing Klansmen to leave the Klan, or a Jew convincing a member of the Westboro Baptist Church to leave her cult and family, it's all about friendship. Because they need to feel like while they're leaving the safety of one tribe, that they're going to be welcomed into the loving arms of another. And that other tribe also has the truth on their side too. It's an interesting thing that someone can be factually wrong, but feel safe socially in a tribe. And they won't want to leave that safety just for the sake of truth. They need truth and safety. They need truth and love. So how do we do that? This is Alain de Botton. He's a British philosopher. I don't know why I pronounced it French. He's alive now. He's still here. He says, sitting down at a table with a group of strangers has the incomparable benefit of making it a little more difficult to hate them with impunity. Prejudice feed off of abstraction. I love that. Prejudice feeds off of abstraction. However, the proximity required by a meal, there's something about handing dishes around, unfurling napkins at the same moment, and even asking a stranger to pass the salt. It disrupts our ability to cling to the belief that the outsider who wears unusual clothes and speaks in distinctive accents deserves to be sent home or assaulted. For all the large-scale political solutions which have been posed to solve ethnic conflict, there are few more effective ways to promote tolerance between suspicious neighbors than to force them to eat dinner together. That's the Abraham Lincoln line. I don't like that man. I must get to know him better. It's so good. Check out this video here. This is, I don't exactly know what's happening here, but I do know that this is in Turkey. So it's in Istanbul. And the guy at the table is singing a Turkish folk song. He's singing it, and then some Greek guy walks up and starts singing the same song in Greek. Apparently the Greeks and the Turks share a lot of folk songs together, which makes sense, right? So but here's a video of these two guys who should hate each other, right? Because one's from Greece, one's from Turkey. They should hate each other, but here they are singing the same song in two different languages. And the warm embrace. So what's the lesson here, right? Again, two men should hate each other, different neighboring enemy countries, but there's something they have in common. There's something, and all you need is that one thing, and that's what start truly being united. I'm a firm believer in the Adam Carolla school of racism, that racism fills a void. So the example that he gave is if you're watching a boxing match or MMA, and you have no idea who any of the people are. You got a black guy versus a white guy. If you're black, you'll root for the black guy. If you're white, you'll root for the white guy. Because that's the most obvious thing that you have in common. It's not racism, right? But it's like, oh, here's the thing. It's the easiest thing to know that you have in common. But let's say you're white and you find out that the black guy went to your high school. Well, then you're going to root for him, right? Like any other similarity transcends, but that's what we're looking for. We're desperately looking for things that we have in common. Let's flip it, right? If that black guy's from America and the white guy's from Russia, right, then you're clearly going to vote for the black guy. Like the race means nothing anymore because you found something that unites you even more. It's not hard to find things we have in common. It's really not. You just need to want to. And the media and activists on both sides, really, but certainly the far left today, they are actively trying to prevent you from even wanting to find things we have in common. They are constantly in the business of dividing us. So there's my Super Tuesday message. Have a wonderful Super Tuesday. Big show tomorrow. The whole gang, Buck, Dana, Jesse, me. We're going to break down it all, and there's a ton to break down. It's going to be a lot of fun tomorrow. We'll see you then. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word.